So I'm really excited that we have Kay Endress with us tonight to present on her really excellent article in Chance magazine. So I want to call to your attention the special issues of Chance Part 1 and 2, Nurturing Statistical Thinking Before College. Some very just excellent pieces in that, in those issues of Chance. And we're delighted that Kay will join us tonight to talk about her article on data surfing. But you see, there are other articles that I definitely recommend, and perhaps you joined us for some of our previous webinars. I'm going to start with the quote that Kay shared with us, that if you're working on a problem you can solve in your own lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. And clearly Kay thinks big. She has her master's in biostatistics and worked as a biostatistician, but fortunately for us, saw the light and is now teaching AP statistics. She is a nationally board-certified mathematics teacher and is very interested in the teaching of introductory statistics using gaming principles. And tonight she is going to present a webinar for us, Creating Data Surfing. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker, Kay Endress.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Rick. Thank you all for helping facilitate this presentation and the invitation to present to you. And thank you all for those of you attending now and for those of you viewing in the future. Once again, I'm Kay Endress, and in case you have not yet read the article, here is a link to it in the first of the two-part series in Chance magazine. And I definitely recommend looking at the hard copy at some point if you can, because the pictures are done full justice in the hard copy, not as much online, although you see them pretty here online too. So what I'm going to start out with is why this article exists in the first place. And one of the first answers to that is that I actually felt like I had a call to action, and it came from JSM in 2009. I actually attended that. Being from the D.C. area, I was anxious to attend that particular conference. And I went to J. Stewart Hunter's Deming lecture, and it was called New Quality Challenges for Statisticians. He spoke mostly about the rise of health informatics or bioinformatics. It was a burgeoning field that didn't necessarily have one particular name to it as a new discipline, and that was rising seemingly without relation to the existing discipline of statistics, even despite overlap and similarities between the two. At the time, he suspected that without a change in our tack, statistics risked becoming irrelevant. And it was a real interesting message for a fairly young statistician to hear. I took note. I shared his concern. I had come from a radiation oncology department before I went to grad school, so I kind of knew a little bit about the health area, and I wondered to myself what I could do now that I had traded in my role as a biostatistician for that of a statistics teacher. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. So as the years rolled by, I paid a great deal of attention to events unfolding in the world, particularly where statistics and data analysis were concerned. Around the same time as JSM in 2009, I had started becoming active on social media, which made keeping up that much easier. Not only did I want to be aware of the current situation and how statistics was faring, but I felt a huge obligation to share that knowledge with my students. I knew that an understanding of the current state of affairs would better prepare them for their own futures. And then also in AMSTAT News over the years, there were a few calls to action from the president of ASA at various junctures. And since I was already primed to think that I had a call to action by Dr. Hunter's presentation, and I was keeping a watchful eye on the ecosystem via social media, and I saw these things in AMSAT News, I kind of took those messages to heart also. And I was happy to see that the American Statistical Association was recognizing the importance of positioning our profession for its future. And then more recently, the This is Statistics campaign, I was also pleased to see that that existed. And to try to help make it more successful, I ended up sending in some feedback from myself and from my students to try to help them run a more successful campaign. So another reason as to why this article exists is because I had come up with a metaphor. And those of you who teach know that metaphor is a powerful teaching tool. And so I felt like that was something that I could share with others. As you know, I was trying to make sense of the current situation based on my past experiences. I was trying to figure out where statistics fits into the data analysis ecosystem. And you also know that I was increasingly connected via social media. All this, and then at some point in the summer of 2014, this metaphor came to me. I'm not sure exactly when it came to me, but somehow or other, ICOT, the International Conference on Teaching Statistics, was a factor in its inspiration. Because when I first shared it, it was at a breakfast one morning at ICOT in Flagstaff, Arizona. I almost blurted it out during the Future Trends in Technology session that happened later on, but I felt just a little too intimidated by the company to speak up at that point in time. But I did subsequently mention it to Nick Horton, and I also followed up by sending in an email to Jessica Utz, who actually responded with some valuable edits, which I incorporated. So I didn't really know then that things would move from there. But with hindsight, I can now kind of see that it was pretty obviously going to happen. So what is this article like? If you haven't read it, it's very different. It's essentially structured as a choose-your-own-adventure article. And that is a rather unique idea. I was invited to submit some sort of a paper on the broader issues related to statistics in high school, changes motivated by the flood of data, and aspects of my surfer metaphor. And of course, when I read that, I was like, how on earth am I supposed to do that? So this was a conundrum in my head that was trying to find a way. Sometime in between these two things, in between my inspiration in creating and expressing the metaphor and this invitation to write this paper, I had heard a story on NPR, National Public Radio, about R.A. Montgomery, who is the publisher and author of some of the Choose Your Own Adventure books, who had passed away last November. And I perked up when I heard the story because I had heard of the concept of Choose Your Own book, even though I had never read one myself. So I had this struggle for how to provide what I was invited to provide, and I also had this really unusual, unique format. And I wondered if this unique format might help me deliver on what I was being invited to do. So what of course happened next was I needed to do more research. So I looked a little bit more into the character of this R.A. Montgomery, and everything that I read encouraged me to continue on in this task. I read things about him being passionate about education all his life and about him focusing on innovative methods of teaching young students. For me, though, the thing that clinched it was his recognition of the Choose Your Own Adventure format as a role-playing game in book form. As it turns out, Ed Packard had come to him. He was a young publisher at the time, Montgomery was, and had come to him with this book manuscript. And after reading it, Montgomery realized that this was basically a role-playing game in book form, and ended up publishing it and writing many of the books himself. I think the last book that he wrote was in September last year, so only a couple months before he passed away. So, as an aside, R.A. Montgomery had also developed a role-playing game for Edison Electric Institute called the Energy Environment Game, and he'd also designed numerous innovative role-playing programs for training Peace Corps volunteers in cultural awareness and sensitivity. These things I didn't know, but they just sort of added to the idea that this was a man who was essentially about education. And so it seemed like moving forward with this type of format, even though I thought to myself it was a bit of a harebrained idea to write my article as a Choose Your Own Adventure, I decided I might go ahead and move forward with it. After all, I found out that Choose Your Own Adventure series was the fourth best-selling children's series of all time. So it seemed like there was at least some momentum behind this idea. And if nothing else, there would be a lot of people out there who had read these books and knew the format. So how did I actually go about doing this? And I'm not really even sure what to call it, because it's not that I have one creative process, but I implemented a creative process of mine. And pictured here is my first diagram of what this article might contain. So the first thing that I did was I went to a cafe. There's one close to my house that I walked to, and I took a sketchbook and I took a pencil, because I knew this was going to require more than just words. I'm a very verbal person. I love to read. I read cereal boxes at the breakfast table. But it wasn't going to be done justice with just words. I was going to need more than that. So, of course, you can see from my outline that there aren't any pictures on it, so you can kind of sense that I'm much more verbal than picture-oriented. But I started out with the first question and choices, and then just kept branching out from there. At the end of my session at the cafe, I think this sheet was mostly complete. I still had a few details to fill in, and of course you can sort of see some things were obviously edits later on. But the real kicker, the thing that made me go forward with this full speed, was after my session at the cafe, I realized the effect that drafting this structure of the article had on me was profound. I felt more motivated, more called to act than before I began. It was like the format encouraged me even more. And I thought, if it's encouraging me when I'm not reading the thing, I'm creating it, it's got to be somewhat motivating to somebody who would read it. And so not only was I going to make this article a Choose Your Own Adventure article, but I was going to be tenacious about it. That was the only format that the article could take to be effective in calling others to action. As it turns out, many of the things in the article, probably almost all of them, relate to my life or what I might wish I had done or what I might wish that I will do. There's always some relationship. In fact, there's so much of it is autobiographical that the work on this webinar ended up being a lot more autobiographical for me than I realized. This just seems like a reasonable place to talk to you about STACK I've already mentioned that I'm much more verbal and not so picture-oriented. So I knew this, and I knew that this article was going to need something visual in order to be a successful article. So I teach over 140 students these days every year, and so that's a large pool of talent there. And a lot of times I teach people who are very skilled artists. It's not unusual for students to be dragging an art portfolio to class. And in fact, I was telling them about this article just yesterday, and in one of the classes that I was mentioning it to, I said something about the fact that my student last year had done the figures and had to, of course, mention the artist who was sitting in the room there too, and everybody applauded for her as much as they were applauding for my article. So at any rate, what I did was I put out a call to all my students, and I said, hey, does anybody feel like they might want to spend some time with me creating some figures for an article that I've written? And I was so fortunate that Michael wanted to do this. As it turns out, he had wanted to take the second year of commercial art with our fantastic teacher, Ms. Messer, but his schedule wouldn't allow it. So he was already wanting to express himself more creatively, and my request came at the perfect time and provided him the opportunity to do that. And just to reiterate, if you haven't seen the hard copy of the Chance magazine, I highly recommend it. That format really shows off Michael's figures to best advantage. And while I'm on this tack, I'll mention that I really have to acknowledge the expert editing that Chance magazine folks provided. Scott Evans and company did a great job, and they were absolutely great to work with. I especially appreciated Melissa Gotherman's efforts to showcase Michael's figures and the care she took in deciding where to place and where to break the text for the article. Because she actually read it, you could really tell that she knew where we should break and where we shouldn't, and she made excellent decisions everywhere. So I'm just very, very grateful for all of that assistance. And of course, I'm also grateful for the permissions that I got from the Choose Your Own Adventure people. They're a very small publisher. Their publisher's name is Choose Co., and they're a very small group, and I think they were impacted greatly by the passing of R.A. Montgomery. And I was really contacting them just a month or so after, just a month or two afterwards. So they worked really hard with me to make this happen too. So let's go into a little bit more detail about also how I did this. One of the things that obviously I did quite a bit of is try to imitate the format, imitate what Montgomery did. So here's another of my draft diagrams for how this article was going to go. One of the other things that I found when I went to the Choose Your Own Adventure site is this wonderful site that was done by Christian Swinehart. And let me get up to the top here. I guess it's going to take a little while for your screens to update anyway. But they linked to this website, and he's got all sorts of different data visualizations of Choose Your Own Adventure books on here. And as soon as I saw this is another thing that just encouraged me that this was the right format to try out with this article. Because if anything, the readers of Chance magazine would appreciate a good data visualization. So he did things like color coding, whether the page has a decision to be made on it, or whether it's simply a page that houses an illustration or choiceless text. And then he color-coded to indicate what type of ending it was, whether it was a great one, whether it was a favorable one, a mediocre one, a disappointing one, or a catastrophic one. And it's very interesting, the things that he did to display what was in these Choose Your Own Adventure books. And so I was really inspired, and I figured that I was going to have to include something to pay tribute to the idea that you could visualize the data behind such a choose your own adventure. In the end, I think I went for something because he has horizontal displays. He has more network type displays, which are very interesting. But in the end, it was kind of a simpler, linear arrangement of pages with some connector lines that I thought was going to do my article justice. So if I go back to the presentation here, and you can look at my hand-drawn copy, I ended up just looking at the various decisions to be made and how they were going to be all connected to each other. Interestingly, Christian says on his website, it's also fair to ask which came first, the choice structure or the story. Oh, here's the on this next slide is the URL for that website. It's also fair to ask which came first, the choice structure or the stories. In the case of crossword puzzles, the puzzle writer's first decision is typically the pattern of blacked out squares to build off of. Next comes a compatible set of interconnecting words, and finally the clues. One wonders whether Choose Your Own Adventure pages were written out of the need to fill in predetermined positions in the tree, or in a more organic scenario, whether the tree was simply an emergent pattern falling out of the choices in the story. And as soon as I read that, I thought, well, there's an obvious question for me, which is it for my article? And honestly, I'm not sure I have a good answer. It's not exactly clear. I think maybe it's a little bit of both. If we look back a couple slides at my other diagram, I started out with the choice structure and just answered as I went and tried to decide how many different possibilities there would be for any given question. So when I look at this, I think it was more emergent. But then when I go to this next diagram, if you look at the pencil-drawn box in the middle on the left-hand side that says Big Data there, that was added because I wanted a particular structure, and I finally decided how to do that. So there's a little bit of both going on there. So it's kind of interesting. I liked the fact that I was considering it. This webinar has given me some things that I wouldn't have had otherwise, like this moment of reflection. I did continue to read about how Montgomery structured his book when he did Choose Your Own Adventures, or in general the series, how the series books were structured. I read that often Montgomery would incorporate infinite loops in his stories, usually with some reference to the place being familiar. And the reader's way, the only way out then at that point is to restart the adventure. And so that intrigued me. And so naturally I had to put one in. So you can look at my pencil drawing. If you start out with volunteer, then you have no choice. Your next point of entry is to search for more resources. And then once you complete that, you read that you need to volunteer, and all of a sudden you're you've fallen into the infinite loop. There was also mention of how occasionally there would be very abrupt dead ends, and sometimes the reader's character would die, but I didn't necessarily want to have a catastrophic outcome in my article. One of the other things I read about is how he might incorporate a different task that could only be chosen by breaking the rules and turning to a random page. So at some point, I decided that big data should be one of those. So if you've read the article and you read the big data part, you broke the rules to get there. And I knew you would because big data is a bright, shiny object right now. So readers are likely to gravitate towards it. So that was my little tribute to Montgomery there. And looking at the structure of the article and looking at the article itself wouldn't be complete if I didn't admit that a lot of this stuff relates to things that I know that are much more intimately connected to my life. So I always thought of this while I was writing it as semi-autobiographical, but it's probably a bit more than that. Here's a picture of me at the Grand Canyon during the ICOT tour that we went on in summer of 2014. Some additional points that I'll just mention that are in the article that really do relate to me or situations that I know. I actually do have a friend with twin daughters, and I actually do think about whether I'll be able to teach them. Michelle Everson actually did invite me to be on a panel, and I actually really do believe that she does do that fairly frequently, recognizing the potential in others before they might even recognize it themselves. Hadley Wickham sessions, although I don't know him personally, I do tend to attend his sessions because even though they're technically most of the time over my head, there's always some sort of nugget of something that I pick up when I'm in there, and it's always a great presentation. If nothing else, I can pick up how he's approaching what he's doing. Kaggle is something that I read about when I was trying to keep up for my students, and the whole concept intrigued me. I certainly haven't crossed the frontier of actually entering a Kaggle competition, and I haven't figured out how to be a teacher hosting a Kaggle competition, but I think both of those are at least somewhat attractive to me, and I wouldn't be surprised if something along those lines happens in the future. Jessica Utz, generous help. She actually did help me, and I sense that she's a fairly generous person, and so I included that detail just to kind of encourage people to get in touch with other people. If you don't ask, the answer is always going to be no, so it's always worth trying to get in touch with people. Jennifer had just put out on social media that she had been working on the enemy tank problem, so I incorporated that detail right away. I had listened to Nick Horton's cause webinar, so I included that in this. USCOTS and ICOTS are both conferences that I've been to, that I know about, that I think are really, really valuable to statistics educators, so naturally those went in. I am a high school teacher in North Carolina, and I do have some issues with resources and things, so I had to be real and mention the reality of life. And although I don't teach online, I do use online learning management systems with my students, and primarily that came about because of winter weather interrupting our flow and interrupting our channels of communication. So it's an effort to try to keep things going in the winter when I want my kids to be learning about band playing or inference or whatnot. So I do a lot of those things. And even the things that I haven't mentioned here have some sort of tangential connection to me. So at this point, I'm going to transition to what I'm calling life after the article, even though that's not necessarily the best title. As Donna mentioned at the beginning, I'm really interested in using gaming principles to teach statistics. I haven't figured out how to do that yet, but it's going to happen someday. It's just going to take some time to really do it well. It's worth noting that I'm not a gamer. I've not, even though by age I probably could have grown up playing video games, they didn't interest me, so I didn't. But some experience that I've had here in recent years playing games has opened my mind to the value of games as a pedagogy approach. And honestly, my interest in gaming does predate the article's creation by, at least 10 years or so. One of the quotes that I found, probably in the Serious Games book, is, "All systems of play are, at base, learning systems." So in researching R.A. Montgomery, I couldn't help but notice he was highly influenced by a book called Serious Games. He, before getting involved in the Choose Your Own Adventure series, he had worked at a consultant run by the guy who published this book, Clark App. And the book was an analysis of the effectiveness of role-playing for problem solving. And that significantly influenced Montgomery, and it sounded like a really natural thing to me, too. So I picked up the book and I started reading, and I found all sorts of things. It talks about a game as a particular way of looking at something. It talked about two different components to the game, like a rational or analytic component as well as an emotional component. And I think I really hit the emotional component when I was designing the article and came away with such a high level of motivation and feeling like I really needed to do this. And I think that really came from the emotional component of the game. And if you think about it, games involve some sort of operational ethic. There's really no excuse for losing. So you kind of have this ethic of personal responsibility to step up the plate and do the best that you can. So that's obviously something that would be helpful if we could have that all the time with our students. So also the Serious Games book talks about how games involve independent decision makers seeking to achieve their objectives in some limiting context. But if you think about it, that's what most real-life activities do as well. So games really do a great job of imitating life in some ways. And he also mentioned about games being a way of satisfying the persistent hunger for experience beyond one's own. And as a very enthusiastic reader, I know that I read sometimes for that as well. Okay. My next slide is where I'm highlighting two things that I think should attract our attention as statisticians or as statistics educators. And that is the two things that we talk about in our course, which are simulation and experimentation. And both of those are really involved in games, or games are actively involved in that as well. So simulation is a valuable teaching tool. We already know this because we know we can do experiments using simulations and get beneficial knowledge from that. So it stands to reason that the simulation that we find in a game is also a valuable teaching tool. And in a game, we're able to create these active problem-solving activities and involve ourselves as teachers as more like coaches. I'm also mentioning on this slide a different book, not just Serious Games, but also this other book called A New Culture of Learning, and I'll mention its full title on a subsequent slide here. But it also brings in the notion of gamers learning through experimentation, and that the gamer disposition demands a better way and a more original response. And that's what we really need in our problem solving, isn't it? We need to find the better way. We need to find a more original response that's going to solve the problem. So I'm just going to read a few quotes that I found from the Serious Games book and then a couple that I found from A New Culture of Learning. So first from Serious Games, the abstract representation of real life in game form does not render the game any less capable of teaching true knowledge. A simulation or simplified representation of reality is always involved in a game, and the game itself becomes an active, dynamic, and changing learning environment. The players assume realistic roles, face problems, formulate strategies, make decisions, and get fast feedback on the consequences of their actions. In short, serious games offer us a rich field for a risk-free, active exploration of serious intellectual and social problems. And as I kind of read those, I kind of recognized that, at least in some aspects, you get that even just from a choose-your-own-adventure book or article. And so I think it's a powerful lever to try to get at the learning that we all want to encourage. From the new culture of learning, which is not only about games, we have the role-playing that students undertake in games that simulate life. It's excellent preparation for the real roles they will play in society in later life. And even when common solutions are known, the gamer disposition demands a better way, a more original response to the problem. On both superficial and deeper levels, games as learning tools can help us access better student motivation. And I think in this day and age, if you don't have any problems with student motivation in your classroom, then hats off to you. So we're always looking for better ways to motivate our students, and games can provide just a superficial motivation, but they can also provide a deeper level motivation. Another thing that's really important is that games can help us get at some of the skills that we don't teach so well using conventional methods, like complexity, when there are parallel sub-processes, and allocation of resources, which is always a difficult thing, satisfying minimum objectives and optimizing achievement, or decision-making with incomplete information or uncertainty. Has anybody ever heard of that? Sounds very familiar to our subject, doesn't it? Conflict dynamics and intuitive problem solving, learning on different levels. Those sorts of things can possibly be done more effectively through a serious game than through conventional education. And the last bullet point talks about game design as a means of learning, and I think that's really powerful. I experienced it just by designing this article, and I've used it in my classroom last week when my students created casino games, which is a fairly common design task for high school students taking statistics. But I think that's a real powerful way to teach. So I'm going to wrap up this quick discussion of gaming with my three favorite resources, plus the game that convinced me that games teach and that games can change your life. So the first is a classic. If you haven't read it, I highly encourage you to. I read it and took detailed notes on it about 9 years ago. G describes how games train players in semiotic domains, such as statistics. He talks about within this semiotic domain, there exist typical ways of thinking, acting, interacting, valuing, and believing, and that an academic discipline is not primarily content, but a lived and historically changing set of distinctive social practices. Active, critical learning in any semiotic domain should have as its ultimate goal for learners to become designers in that semiotic domain. And so this book is just full of really great stuff, and particularly if you haven't taught before, it's a great way to learn about how to teach. But it's just an absolute classic. The next one is the one that I've already mentioned, A New Culture of Learning, Cultivating the Imagination for a World of Constant Change. And this is by Douglas Thomas along with John Seeley Brown. And it's a really great book, and it's not only about games, but it does mention games as a serious approach to learning. And so I found lots that was of interest in that book. And then next two things are both from Jane McGonigal. Reality is Broken was her latest book. I'm not sure if she has anything out. Oh yes, she has her new one out on the book that Super Better is her new book, I think, named after the game that she created. But Reality is Broken, Why Games Make Us Better and How They Can Change the World is just a great, more modern take on the value of games and how they can teach. It discusses concepts such as flow, intrinsic reward, collective intelligence, instant feedback, systems thinking, always playing at the limits of your ability, and always connecting the individual to something bigger. And she also came up with a few quotes that I really like. The first one is, with games, learning is the drug, and that's by Ralph Koster in a book called A Theory of Fun for Game Design. And the second quote is, all play means something, and that's from Johan Huizinga, who's a 20th century Dutch philosopher. And part of the reason why I read her book in the first place is because I played this game called Virgin Evoke, a crash course in changing the world. And I don't really know exactly how to describe it to you. I can say that I didn't fully complete the entire game because I was very busy. I think that was the same time I was also taking the course with Michelle Everson. And so I had tons of work for her course, and I had work for other things that I was doing, and then I was trying to teach my students at the same time. So I was kind of a busy camper. But Virgin Evoke sent me on missions and quests, and I had choices as to how I fulfilled these, and in so doing, what I learned in the process. At the end of the experience, I felt as if I had followed a course, and I probably mentioned this to more than one person. I really, really, really seriously felt like I had followed a course. And looking back now, in retrospect, many of my present-day activities and pursuits were born out of what I learned playing that particular game. And that was a very, in a way, simple game because it was just online. There was a story, and you clicked on various missions and quests, and then it gave you choices as to what to do and how to produce your product, your learning product. But there wasn't like a whole lot of intricate pieces to it. So it was just powerful. I could see that it taught me quite a lot, and I didn't expect that. So I'm going to switch away from the concept of games for a moment because I feel like I would be seriously remiss if I didn't share with you this amazing book that I've just finished reading for a book club that I'm in. As I turned the last page, I seriously uttered, wow. And it was very similar to the same wow that I said when I saw the Grand Canyon for the first time. Honestly, this is his PhD dissertation from the Columbia School of Education. It's a graphic novel, and it's amazing on so many different levels. It's amazing. I've recommended it to art teachers already. I've recommended it to a philosophy teacher that I took a course from, and I have yet to recommend it to all the teachers I know, but I think that's the next step, because even though he's not overtly talking about education at every turn, he is behind the scenes talking about education everywhere. And I'm sorry I'm not sharing any more pictures in the book with you, but it's very easy to find things online, and you'll get a sense for how extensive this is, how expansive his horizons are. So if you think my article is something different, check out this book. But one of the things that he talks about, he starts off with a flatland kind of analogy for education without explicitly stating that he's talking about education. As a one-size-fits-all, we all get packed into shipping containers and facing exactly the same direction because we've all been processed exactly the same way. It's a very depressing look at the world. And he then spends the rest of the book trying to show how we get out of that, how we get to a better place, how we unflatten. And some of the things that he suggests are multiple vantage points, new ways of seeing, paying attention to curiosity, and recognizing dimensionality, that you can look at things from different viewpoints and see different aspects. And his recognition that understanding is often grasping this in relation to that. So I know I'm not doing this book justice, and I know it's kind of weird that I'm just mentioning it the way I am, but it is truly worth checking out. So I think that's all I'm going to do with that. The next thing I'm going to talk about is an experience that I had at the beginning of last month. I went to an event that was hosted in Wilmington, North Carolina, and it brought together professionals from lots of different disciplines, but primarily computing and a few from emergency management, but mostly computing and software developers and that sort of folks. It was called the North Carolina Emergency Management Hack Shop, and it was sort of a hackathon kind of event. I put the image in here because if you look at the picture that's on the upper right-hand corner there, that is actually my team at work. That hand there is my hand. And so it's kind of nice that we were actually in this photograph. And I'll tell you a little bit about the event. I came to attend it because I've never been to a data hackathon. I've never been to any of these types of events, but I see that they are happening more and more in lots of different places for lots of different things, hosted by lots of different people. And this one caught my attention because it was on the theme of emergency management, and that's a field that's of interest to me personally. I also wanted to go to Wilmington, so it was a good excuse to go to the beach. But the concept was like a shortened timeline for a hackathon. And so in the beginning, you had experts explaining the current status of affairs, including problems that they have identified as needing solutions. And then they kind of identify important data sources and other resources that they know of to help the team. Individuals then give pitches on problems that they want to work on, and then teams form around those problems. And then the teams work together for about a day and are expected to come up with a prototype solution by the end of the day. The reason I mention it is because it hit me kind of hard. At this hack shop, I experienced for myself the deep chasm between my own conservative approach to data analysis and the quick fix approach that's taken by others and valued by the format of the event itself. Consequently, I felt much less helpful to my team than I should have been. And honestly, no one seemed to be clamoring for the sole statistician in the room. And that was a surprise to me. I would have thought that they would have wanted the statistician and they would have been asking me things, but they really didn't. On the other hand, when I was expressing a little bit of disappointment in myself, one of the organizers disagreed and explained how valuable my focus on the question and the audience had been for my team, because I was the only one saying, hey, we haven't decided what we're answering nor who we're answering it for. Excuse me. So I mention it here because I think the rise of events like this, particularly those that are not organized by statisticians themselves, provide an important opportunity for statisticians to market our discipline. Conversely, if we do not participate, that sends a very strong message that statisticians are not necessary to the success of teams seeking to use data for decisions and for product generation. So I know for myself personally, I'm going to be looking for more of these events and trying to better prepare myself to be more valuable for teams that I participate on in the future. So I know these last three things have been a little bit different, but here's your recap slide. What I've talked about is why this article in Chance Magazine came about in the first place, because I felt like I had a call to action. I was invited to write a paper, and I had this metaphor too. What this article is, it's a very unusual thing that's formatted similar to the Choose Your Own Adventure book. How the article was generated, just basically trying to imitate that format and create it based on things that I knew or thought that I knew well enough to write about. Additionally, how this article kind of relates to my life, and then things that I am interested in moving forward, gaming principles and resources for that. This book on flattening is really worth a look. And hack shops, hackathons, that sort of events are worth looking into, I think, for many of us, if you have the time. If nothing else, it's something very different to pursue, and it's a very different way of thinking about things, and it's worth being involved from that angle. Here is also, for your convenience, is a list of abbreviations that I used here or in the article that I may or may not have adequately defined for you while I was speaking, or I think the article I did a good job of spelling out everything somewhere at the first use, but this presentation might have been a little less so. So at this point, I have reached the end of what I was going to present, and I know Donna has been looking for questions, so I'm ready for that sort of thing, and I will switch to my contact information for the remainder of the time here.
Great. Thanks so much, Kay. That was really fascinating. And I want to just let people know they can still send in questions, but I'll get us started with this one, and that is, do you use writing in the teaching of your statistics classes?
Do I use writing in the teaching of my statistics classes? Yes. I in fact, the very first time I taught, one of my students accused me of making them read and write more than the English teachers did. So I'm trying to think of what writing thing I can point to right at the moment. Sometimes just a reflection on things that they've done. So it's more informal things. I don't necessarily have them blog or anything like that, although I know those types of things would be useful for the future. Sorry, I've also got a cat trying to do stuff.
So follow up to that, did the experience of writing the article and having the collaborative relationship with an artist make you want to think about collaborative projects with your students? So something that might be interclass.
Oh yeah, and I wish I had more opportunities to do that anyway, because I'm always thinking like that. In fact, at the JSM meeting that I went to, I had set my goal the year before to actually present at that meeting, and I did. And one of the things that I was presenting about was a collaborative unit between myself and the biology teacher. We did an epidemiology sort of thing. I wish I did more of it, because I really do think, particularly the way my school is structured, we have lots of different really incredibly neat programs. And but I like the question because I really had a super time collaborating with Michael. He was of course he was my student, but I didn't really necessarily treat him that way. And so that wasn't necessarily the way our relationship was during this collaboration. He was a joy to collaborate with. He did everything I asked, and when he didn't know how to spell Jessica Utz's name, so he didn't know that that's what I had written on my diagram. So I had to give him those sorts of corrections. But he was so speedy with fixing everything. it was just, and he actually listened to what the article was about and understood and really seemed to appreciate what I was trying to do with the article, which was very cool.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, but so sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You please.
I was just going to say I've often been thinking about how, because everybody on this call understands that statistics relates to everything else, so there's really no limit to the collaborations you could do. I actually sat in lunch in the workroom one time, and it was myself, a social studies teacher, and the Spanish teacher, and we were all talking about how we teach inference in our classroom, and it was hilarious. It was the most amazing conversation because we were all really talking about inference in our respective disciplines, and it was an amazing, mind-blowing experience. So, but the reality of things sometimes gets in the way.
Yeah, sure.
So,
well, the last question that I have is, what piece of advice would you give to someone who hasn't yet taken the plunge to write an article, and so how to get started? Maybe not for chance, but the Statistical Teachers Network, or what advice would you give to a colleague to get started?
I think I would. If I were trying to get myself started, I think I would start with setting myself a mission and trying to complete it in a satisfactory way. And it might even seem like it's a very difficult mission. And it might even be something that takes some time. But I think when you challenge yourself, you find out you can do more than you think you can, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. Well, those are the questions that we had. So I think we want to thank you very much. I see that you've obviously put your contact information up, and I want to let everyone know that the webinar, a link for the webinar will be posted on the ASA website. So
great.
Thanks so much for sharing this with us. That was fascinating.
Thank you. I really appreciate your help, Donna. And thank you, everybody.
So, Rebecca, I think as moderator, I'm turning it over to you to end the session.
Well, thanks so much. We're going to stop the recording and close the meeting. Thank you so much, Kay, and thank you for everybody for participating.